Welcome everyone to this Science in the Bible Club presentation. My name is Joe Kaiser. I'm the co-advisor of this club. This is Peter Murnane. He is the president. We have three wonderful panelists that I'll introduce in a minute here. But first, maybe, Peter, can you have a word of prayer?
Yeah, absolutely. Dear Father, thank you for all of us joining today and having the opportunity to hear from our three guest speakers. Help us to grow in your word and relationship with you, and to learn more about our faith and the science that supports our faith. In your name we pray.
Amen. So we have with us today three different colleges represented, which I think is cool. We have Dr. John Asbury from the College of Science, Dr. Chad Dechow from Agriculture, Dr. Ken Brentner from Engineering. So we got quite a breadth here. And I have 5 questions that I'm going to start with as moderator, one at a time, and we'll see where this takes us. But we're going to try to make this conversational, and if we have time, which I think we probably will, we can do questions at the end. And then also there is a book table. One of the things that this club does is book discussions, or as I like to say, chapter discussions, since students won't read full books anymore. We just do chapters. So in the middle of some nice fun chapter discussions, and there's a sign up on the mailing list. If you're going to are interested in being on the mailing list, Peter will send you 25 messages a day. No, just kidding. 1 or 2 a month. And if you want to be in the mailing list, you can sign up over there. So, okay. Question 1. What do you gentlemen do at Penn State anyway? John, you want to start?
Sure. John Asbury. I'm a professor of chemistry, and I came in 2005. I teach. I teach courses, of course, and I run a research group, and have various, and then the usual workshops and seminars and travel, things like that. Classes, I teach Chem 110, so first semester general chemistry in the fall. So that's a big 300-person class. And then I teach in the spring, I teach a quantum mechanics class, second semester physical chemistry. So that kind of gives, upper level, junior, senior level classes. Research-wise, my research group, we call ourselves ultra-fast spectroscopists, which means we make measurements very slowly, but with very fast time resolution. And we study chemical reactions relevant to conversion of sunlight into electricity and conversion of sunlight into chemical bonds for solar fuels applications.
Chad, what do you do?
All right. Well, first, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, and it's great to see everybody here. I am, by training, a dairy cattle geneticist. And so in terms of my teaching role, I teach a course called Animal Genetics and Selection in the fall, which has about 100 students, and then a couple other courses that are a little bit smaller and more specialized in dairy cattle management and more specific dairy cattle genetics as opposed to just general animal genetics. So that's kind of my teaching role, and I advise the Dairy Science Club as well. My research is, of course, around dairy cattle, and a lot of it's trying to improve cattle populations, to improve how efficiently we produce dairy products. But at the same time, we don't want cows that give a lot of milk and are really stressed and unhealthy and so forth. So it's trying to optimize cows that are healthy and fertile and at the same time productively efficient, because our population is growing, but the amount of land we have available is not. So we need animals that are more efficient. So that's kind of my research area. And then since I'm in the College of Ag, we do some odds and ends with the 4-H dairy judging team and so on and so forth. Things like that as well, which I enjoy. So thanks for having me again.
Ken, what do you do?
Well, I'm in aerospace engineering. I actually grew up on a farm in Iowa, so I grew up with, it's interesting to hear Chad's work, but in aerospace engineering, I teach courses in fluid mechanics and aerodynamics, rotorcraft aerodynamics. Aeroacoustics is my research area, and so I teach courses in noise. So a variety of courses at different times. I have a large group. It's a little bit smaller, but it's large. Tyler's one of my grad students here, so I have about 10 grad students right now, not all on campus, and that's more than I like, but I try to spend time with them. That's important to me. I do research in rotorcraft and aircraft noise, wind turbine noise in the past some. So I worked at NASA for 20 years before I came here, so it's sort of a continuation of that. So I'm not too active, but I'm the faculty advisor for Bridges, which is an international, it's a part of Crew, but it's for international students, a Christian group on campus, and that's kind of special. I can help support them in some way. And that's a lot of things I do, but there's quite a few more I could go do.
Faculty wear a lot of hats, don't they? So, second question, how did you come to Christ? Any of you?
Well, I'll start that since I was just talking. I'm warmed up. I came to Christ over a period of time. It really started back in high school. I went to a small high school in Iowa, 64 my graduating class, and my friends turned out to be Christians, and they took me to groups, and I thought they were weird, but they were nice and friendly. And then in college, I decided I had friends again that were believers in Christ, and they invited me to Bible study, and I just told God one night that I didn't quite understand why, what was different about my friends in high school and these other people I met, but I wanted to be like that, and I told God I would follow him, and he's been very good. Throughout time, I was in engineering. Over the years, I've learned a lot more, and I've found science, we were talking about here today, to be very compatible. I worked at NASA Langley Research Center for, well, including my co-op time, 20 years. And over those years, Christ has been central to my life. In fact, I came to Penn State because I felt God calling me to be a Christian professor. I didn't know what that was going to mean, but that was important, so that's why I left NASA.
So, how did that come about? What were you feeling, or what was happening that was convincing you that God was calling you to come be a Christian professor?
I was a Christian for quite some time then, and I was, my family supported me, but I wanted to be open to wherever God led me to go. Whatever God wanted me to do, I wanted to be open to that. And so shortly after I got my PhD, Georgia Tech Research Institute called me, and I just didn't pay any attention to that. Then a few years later, University of Maryland called. They were trying to convince me to come there as a professor, and I had my first master's student that was working with me at NASA said, he was a godly young man, we're still good friends, and he said, if you're going to follow God, you have to at least look, don't you? And so I went to Maryland and I interviewed, and my family went with me, and we just didn't feel God calling us there. And then I'd given up. I wasn't going to go to I had UCLA called me and tried to get me there. I didn't go. They didn't follow through with the interview. And then I'd given up, but all of a sudden I kept getting all sorts of notes and advertisements from Penn State, and I went to my pastor and prayed about it. I went to my small group of men I went with at NASA, and they were Christians. I went to my mentor, who wasn't a Christian at NASA. Everybody was saying this was a great opportunity. I really should do this. And I went to my family because I was reluctant, and we all prayed separately, and all my kids came back and said they felt like God was calling us there. And I could tell you lots more stories how God paved the way, but we came and interviewed. We knew that the chances were slim. I know there was over 140 applicants, but we knew God was calling us, so we just got the house ready to sell, And we started in October, and in April they finally told us, and we came. And so it's been a journey here, what to do, but it helped me a lot in those days of tenure. I was 40 years old, but I still had to go through tenure. And at times when it was very difficult, it wasn't like I could just decide I don't like this, because I felt a calling to come here. And it wasn't a career move. It was, if God brought me here, and we all believe that, then I needed to trust him here. And I care a lot about students. I hope that comes across in my lectures. That's probably enough, but I can tell you more if you want to know more.
Well, we'll see where this goes here. Chad?
Yeah, so I grew up on a small dairy farm in New York State and went to an even smaller high school than he went to, graduated in 57. But, my parents were Christians, in particular my dad, and so, he took us to church. But that just was not an important part of my life at all. And most of my friends were kind of similar to me, went to church when their parents took them, and that was about the extent of it. And that remained true throughout my undergraduate years and through the beginning of my master's degree and so forth. And then, a couple things happened. I was just from the outside looking in, looking at the person I had become, not real happy with that. And I'd met a girl who's now my wife, and so started to get a little more serious about life in general, and that caused me to kind of step back and reevaluate where I was. And at that particular point in time, that's when I really repented and submitted myself to Christ at that point in time in my mid-20s. So that was kind of my faith journey. And I was actually here at Penn State tearing that hole. I got my master's degree here at Penn State and worked part of my PhD here as well. And then my advisor moved to Tennessee, and I went with him. And then I came back and now teach some of the courses that he taught. That's kind of how I ended up back here. But so it just wasn't an important part of my life. But I had a lot of those things that I had been taught over time had their influence on me. They were imprinted on me, and I knew, and I never necessarily had a problem with God, or I wouldn't say that I necessarily disbelieved per se. It just wasn't important. I just didn't pay attention, and that kind of changed in my mid-20s. So
I came to Christ when I was a sophomore in college. I didn't really care anything about having faith of any sort before. Ken, your story of noticing friends who were different, that was my story as well. God brought me to a dorm, and there were guys on the floor. I sort of had a first year to observe them. I'm an experimentalist, so I observe things, right? So I observed them. And there was, I remember this moment. It's just going to sound strange maybe, but there's two guys. They were leaders of a group. I ended up in a Bible study with them. They were involved with a Christian group called the Navigators. I would eat my lunch at this particular cafeteria, and one of the guys came in and he didn't get any food. He just sat down at a table and waited. I thought, that's weird. Why would you come to a cafeteria and just wait? And then the other guy came in, and the guy who was seated stood up. They greeted each other. They chatted for a while. Then they went and they got their food. They had planned to rendezvous and have lunch. And I was in such a place in my life at that moment when I thought that was exceptional. I had never really seen friendship, especially with men, like that. And I was like, wow, I don't know what that's about, but I want to get to know those guys more. Well, so then come the beginning of the sophomore year, they asked, hey, we're organizing investigative Bible study of the book of John. Are you interested? I wasn't really interested in the Bible study, but I was interested in getting to know those guys better, and they were leading it, so I was okay, sure. And I kind of expected that I had this very naive impression that Christians weren't very smart. I don't know. It sounds stupid to say, but that's what I thought. And these guys they did not fit that description. They really knew the scriptures. They challenged me intellectually, both in terms of understanding what the scriptures had to say, but also the rigor of the logic and the ability to really dig into the word and see what it meant. And I had a respect for them. And then through the sort of process of God just kind of doing some work in my heart, I came to realize that, while I had excelled at academics, and we probably all could say that as I were here, I suppose, it wasn't what I was really after. It wasn't satisfying what I really wanted. And the Lord was just doing a work to show me that what you're after is me. This is God speaking to me. Not speaking, but the thoughts in the mind. And so we had been studying this book, John, and I started to look at it differently. And I thought, okay, well, there's 4 Gospels, so I should read them all. So I started in Matthew, and I read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and then I spent about a year in the book of Romans. And somewhere in chapter 3, I became a Christian.
Most people don't have this down. Particular chapter of the Bible.
Yeah. So with one of the campus leaders said, he said, I could, we realize that you've become a Christian, and then I asked, well, why didn't anybody share the gospel with me? And kind of to my shame, he said, well, they were intimidated. They thought you would make them feel foolish. Isn't that sad? I felt pretty bad about that. So I hope to never do that. But anyway, that's how I came to Christ.
Okay, so I've been reading some of these books like Case for the Creator, and one of the things that they frequently bring up is the idea that many young people, when they get in high school, go away from the church or spiritual matters, or however you want to say it, and many of them cite their science classes as the reason. And I mean, this is, I think, statistically proven that this happens. You get to high school science classes, they're essentially not about God, and really, in a lot of ways, trying to explain away God. And at that point, if you're buying that, then you're thinking, wow, maybe I got this all wrong. Okay, so what I would like to know from the three of you, and you may want to talk about this through various phases of your life, but has science helped your faith? Has science undermined your faith? Or is science just neither? It's just science is here and your faith is there. So, Chad, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so, sequencing the human genome and how that opened things up has really been pretty exciting if you were a Christian scientist at the end of the day. And maybe we didn't expect it to be that way. But I think, I did go through a period where I wrestled. Struggled's not the right word. I wrestled a lot with my faith and scientific views. The views of the scientific community might be a better way to put it, and trying to meld those two things together. And they did not go together very well. And the more I learned about, in the biological sciences, evolution, the more I learned about that, the less that really fit with Scripture, and I didn't want it to be that way. And so finally, I just got to a point, well, why do you care that these two things go together? And is it because you're so convinced by the scientific evidence that you just cannot hold on to your faith unless you can put these two things together? Well, it wasn't really that, what it really was was the path of least resistance. If I can bring those two things together, nothing's, my faith is sound, I agree with the rest of the world, there's no conflict. Wouldn't that be wonderful? But when I really was honest with myself, it didn't work together well. And then when they started to sequence the human genome, a lot of the assumptions that we had made about genetics really kind of started to fall. And a lot of it really depends on your starting position. If you start from the position that evolution is true, the scientific and genomic data confirm that evolution is true. If you start from the position, well, that maybe it's not, then all of a sudden it doesn't. You can find lots of holes in there. So just to give you a few examples. So we all, when I was young, learned that we are 99% the same as chimpanzees. Our DNA is 99% the same as chimpanzees. Well, that was a lie. 1.5% of our genome are genes that actually produce, my phone's ringing there. It's probably trying telling me soccer practice is canceled or something because it's raining. But only 1% of our genome is our genes, and that's the only part that we could really compare for a long, long time before we sequenced the genome. That 1.5% of our genome is the same. But the reason we're not a chimpanzee has nothing to do with our genes. Your genes are the same as a cow's genes almost, the same as a dog's genes, same as a pig's genes. The difference is the rest of the stuff that we consider junk. And so we had been calling this junk for 20 some years, and that was what made us human, at least physically. That is what made us human. And when you start to line that up, it's not 99% the same as a chimpanzee. Not that the percentage really matters, and we debate about what the percentage is because we don't know. And then pseudogenes were another thing. Well, these are remnants of genes that have essentially, we had a gene duplication event through evolutionary processes, and we didn't need 2 copies of that gene, so one of them just kind of faded away and was left with this non-functional pseudogene. Well, guess what? Pseudogenes are a big part of what regulates the 1.5% of our protein-coding genes. So pseudogenes are incredibly important. And in fact, that was used by many people, including Richard Dawkins had a famous statement about, well, if we had a creator, he's not a very smart one because we've got all these duplicated faulty genes floating around in our genome. Well, we just didn't know what the genome did at that particular point in time. And I think for me, the other part that really has come together over time is that from a mathematical modeling standpoint, we've always kind of considered genes to have an effect of some sort. This gene does this. It makes a cow give 10 pounds more milk, for instance. And when you use that mathematical formula, you can make evolutionary projections that come out pretty nicely. The problem is that there is not a single gene that we have that does anything by itself. Each and every gene is part of a networked system. And so how do you build a network system with this component here, and then you have to wait a couple 100,000 years before this component comes into place, and then a couple million years, and then this one comes into place, and then all of a sudden now we've got our network. That doesn't work. It's either all or none. And evolutionary theory just does not explain that very well at all. And so I eventually got to the point where, okay, when I look at the genome, what I see is evidence of genomic decay over time. And that fits pretty well with the fall, doesn't it? So when we look at genes, for instance, that are different in humans and chimpanzees, there are some unique novel human genes, and there are some unique novel chimpanzee genes, and then there are others that are pretty similar but have kind of decayed a bit over time, and they're not really essential to life's function, for instance. And so there was one in particular that influences how big our jaws are. And the theory was that, well, because ours is not the same as chimpanzees, ours doesn't make as big of a jaw, that allowed our cranium to have a different shape, allowed our brains to be bigger, and that's why we're human. Well, what they found out over time was that, well, actually, there are some humans where that gene is still active, and they just hadn't sequenced enough people yet. So a lot of these genes that they held up, there was a language gene, and then there was a headline, the language gene has been dethroned. So there are all of these things that were set up based on scientific theory that just did not hold up to scrutiny because of the Human Genome Sequencing Project. And so it's really been an exciting time. Now, if you're determined that evolution is true, you can still fit that data in and put those pieces together that way. But if you're willing to step back and look at it and say, well, is there another explanation instead of common descent, maybe common design, all of a sudden things start to fit in a different way. And so for me, it's been tremendously, I went from somebody who's trying to fit pieces together that weren't fitting together to somebody whose faith has just been enormously strengthened by how well genome science fits with our faith.
So at the risk of overstepping my moderator bounds here, there is a book over there on the book table called Is Atheism Dead? And it's a recent book, and it's a play on the 1966 Time magazine cover that said, "Is God dead?" And the interesting thing about that, relevant to what you're saying, is that in '66 the space program was going really well, and science was really advancing, and people were thinking, scientists are really smart, they got everything figured out, there's a few things we don't understand, but we're going to figure those out in the next few years. And that book is about the idea that in the 50 years since then, precisely what you're talking about has happened, and that is more and more questions have been raised about science's ability to explain what's going on, and more things that have happened to indicate, oh my gosh, there is a creator, okay? So the fact that the earth has a beginning, I mean, there was a lot of debate on scientists did not like that. One guy said it was repulsive because he didn't like the idea that it pointed to God. Not that the data was wrong, you know what I'm saying? So the point is that, if I paraphrase what you're saying, I think, that initially science was undermining your faith, but as subsequent information in science, the Human Genome Project has come along, it has strengthened your faith. Is that fair?
Very much so.
So that book is a very worthwhile book to consider because it talks about that kind of thing in multiple areas of science. How the more we learn, the more it's pointing to God. The exact opposite of what the 1966 article said was going to happen. So, Ken, what are your thoughts? Does science help or hurt or do nothing to your faith?
Well, it strengthens my faith, but in a bit of a different way. As an engineer, I've always I enjoy order that I see, an organization in the world and in the universe. I see a creator, and it makes sense to me. And when I go deeper in and I learn more about science, they've sort of aligned. It's sort of been a strengthening thing to me. And one of the things I found along the way, I tried to be open and honest, and I'm not always studied as deeply as some people might, but I was trying to be, hey, does this make sense? And what I found was people usually would start with a premise and make the data and make the situation fit the premise, and science didn't really do science, or in some sense, you know, the scientific method where you have a hypothesis and you test it and all that. I mean, I found the same thing with other things. Like when we moved here, the realtors all told me how they were going to price the house, and so being the engineer I was, I did all the calculations with their data, and I didn't come up with the conclusions they came up with. and I find that a lot of times that people have, this is their conclusion, they tell you how but then when I look at it, I don't see that, and I'm I don't trust. I have to do it myself a lot. And they fit together, so that's been pretty important. And I see things in science, like when so I work with noise, and I don't study the anatomy of hearing, but I think of how impressive that is and how great an instrument it is. And yes, we're building instruments that can do certain parts better, but when you think of the whole gamut of what our bodies can do, or what our eyes can see, there's all these things that are we're just sort of being able to do some of it, and it's not really the same. And then our bodies last for long. So everywhere I look, and there's another part of science that I was thinking about this in preparation, and one of the things, and I don't know if John Cimbala is still here. I teach fluid mechanics, and I've always tried to avoid turbulence, but you can't. So think of turbulence and randomness, and to me, I've always said, well, that's the part we don't understand or that I can't explain or something. And somehow I became comfortable. There's always part of what we're doing I can't explain. And especially in the recent years, it's been a great comfort to me, because in my spiritual life, and I think they're so mixed together, I'll tell you that in a minute, that I'm comfortable now not understanding everything in my spiritual life too. There's things I don't understand. We never understand everything. And so I found that makes it easier for me to just trust God. Okay? I don't understand, I was in all the high-risk categories for COVID, and I got COVID, and I said, God, I just trust you. Okay? Everybody else was really worried. It wasn't so bad. I've had it, and it gives me a lot of peace. As a professor and as an engineer, the fact that I can't understand everything is okay. It's our nature sometimes to try to understand everything, to explain everything. And that doesn't seem actually possible. There's always more. The more we learn, the more questions we have. And so that's where it's worked together. I actually, I'll share back how my spiritual life and my career, my engineering scientific life are together. I actually was asked to go on a mission trip while I was still in the tenure process, and I went to Thailand. And so one of the places that they had arranged, this was the Campus Crusade invited me to do this, and I would share my technical talks and just give a couple-minute testimony at the end how Christ was important in my life. And so the president of ranks at university asked me, so why are you here? Are you here to share your faith? Or are you here to share your engineering, your science? And I think God gave me this. I just felt like, I can't really separate them. I am an engineer. I am a professor, and I do study this, and this is an important part of my life, but it's not separate from my faith. It's not, my life is combined. It's really one thing. So I'm here to do both. I mean, I can't not be a Christian, and I can't not be an engineer. I mean, I guess I could stop being an engineer, but they're just together, and so that's why I say the scientific part of my life is not really, and it just goes together. And every time I go looking for, there's these contradictions. I don't actually start out thinking they're contradictions. I just look into it, and often they fall. Okay, if you look at historic or archaeological evidence, people say this, and then I see later, well, over time they found this that disproved it. I love Chad's description now, because I don't know that field very well, but it's like, this is great. This just fits the model I've seen over and over again. That God comes out, and it makes sense, and that's why it's been easy for me to have the two together, because they just make sense. It's not hard to believe for me.
So, John, did you go through the high school period in which you learned biology and chemistry and physics and decided that these spiritual matters were all make-believe?
I don't think.
It's another way of asking how did
Right.
science affect your faith?
Yeah. Well, I didn't feel a conflict, because I didn't have a faith that you would identify as a faith, right? At that time, because and then I had already had the biology, in high school, and then I became a Christian in college, and so that wasn't so much of a. And the driver, I expected to have intellectual problems with Christianity, but I didn't. Well, I did, but I sorted through them pretty easily, and I'll say a few more words about that. But what I found the principal driver for me for coming to Christ was he met me at my need, my spiritual need, and my emotional need, and that was that's what I, and everything else was okay. We'll figure this out. We'll figure out the intellectual stuff. But I wanted to kind of make some comments about your opening question, right? Which was, okay, so people, introduced to, let's say, evolutionary theory as origin of species, right? This is what Darwin, he wrote a book with that title, okay? I had a discussion with my 16-year-old daughter who was taking, biology this year, and they were discussing this, and she was, she was asking me basically, what should I believe? Like, what do we say, right? Which, that's where she is, and I hope that eventually she'll grow to, this is what I believe. But right now she's at, okay, just tell me what the party line is, so we had that discussion, and sort of a short version is, if you start from the false position that there is no God, then evolutionary theory is the best thing you can come up with. But there are enormous missing holes in it. Chad emphasized a number of them. Sort of the idea of irreducible complexity, of where does information come from. These kinds of things they simply don't have an answer. And I shared with her, Abigail's her name. I shared with her that when Darwin was developing his theory, they didn't actually understand. They didn't know about germ theory at that time. They discovered it shortly thereafter. But germ theory is, of course, the realization that when an infection comes, it's because there's some microorganism that was either already there or was floating into the air and found a good growing medium, and then it reproduced. So they didn't understand that. So the idea that you could have some schmutz, and all of a sudden something would start growing out of it, the idea of a spontaneous generation, they didn't even know that insects had organs. It was just the level of knowledge was quite limited at the micro level. So of course it would not be a difficult intellectual leap to say, oh, okay, yeah, stuff just sort of spontaneously generates, creation of information, no big deal. This happens all the time, but we know better now. We know a lot better now, but we still refuse to modify that theory. It's a refusal because it's a belief system. But that's not actually what I wanted to say and answer your question. I'll say briefly, because I don't want to take too much time. I have the privilege of teaching quantum mechanics. And one of the reasons that is such a privilege, well, is because it helps us understand the molecular world. So that's from scientifically, I think that's super awesome. But also, it's weird. The molecular world the term would be absolutely small. That is to say, things have unique properties, and it causes the way we. What I'll say is it reveals the faith that is in science, which sounds controversial to say. But when I say it differently, it won't sound controversial. All physical sciences are founded on things we call postulates. And postulates are educated guesses about how the world works. Okay? You observe stuff, you see patterns, and then you guess, this is how things work. Newton guessed that all masses attract each other, and then did some calculus, and out comes the law of gravitation. Right? Michael Faraday, talked about charges and their interactions, and you postulated that opposite charges attract and like charges repel, and do some more calculus, and then you get Coulomb's law. in quantum mechanics, it's built on the same thing, but because they're weird and nobody's heard them before, they get introduced when you're sort of mentally at a place where you can think about it. And so I love to give an example. It's called the Pauli principle. Maria took my class last year, so she may recognize this. The Pauli principle states that the sign of a wave function has to flip with the exchange of identical fermions. That's the Pauli principle. Okay, like what? Okay, whatever. But it explains the Pauli exclusion principle. It explains why I am not falling through this chair, because the electrons of my body can't occupy the same region of space as the electrons of the molecules in the chair, because it doesn't satisfy that property. It sounds totally weird. Okay, well, that is a faith statement, right? How do you know? Once you work out the implications of it and you go observe, you see that yes, that is in fact how the world works. It's founded on observation, but the fact remains, it is a faith statement. And so I love to be able to kind of introduce. I can't introduce it quite that way in class because I'm representing the university, but I can here. And you guys, this is a Cybele club, so you guys have some thought about technical things. And so science and faith have actually a lot more alignment than we realize they do.
Good. Business about the fermions and the wave sign kind of threw me for a minute. Coming back to Earth now. Okay, so we've been talking about your faith. Let's talk about the faith of others. And there's sort of two ways that I've thought of to ask this, and I've sent them to you. One is somebody asked, how can we be winsome for students for whom science is a stumbling block to their faith? That's one way of thinking about it. The other way that I thought about it is this verse, Romans 1:20, which says, the invisible things of God are clearly seen by the things that are made, even his eternal power and divine nature. At least one translation says it that way. So those are kind of related things, right? If God's word is really true there, and that there's stuff out here that points to his invisible things, which is hard for all of us to accept sometimes, what are they? And I think that relates to the, you have some students or friends or family members who think, science has convinced me that God isn't real and that spiritual matters are just make-believe. What are your thoughts on that? How can we help others with their faith in the context of science, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
So I thought a little, and it didn't take much, is I realized that the thing that attracted me to people of faith was how they cared about me. How there's things like love that as an engineer kind of doesn't fit. But there's love and there's caring and all these things. And I feel like although it may not be my natural state, that what God wants me to do is be caring for people, and may I even say loving to people. And that's where I always start. I mean, I try to care about my class. If anybody's been in my class, Tyler can tell this, I try to learn people's names, and I can't remember names very well, so I ask over and over. It's gotten worse. Well, you guys know that too. But I try, and so people that are stumbling like that, first of all, I care for them just like I try to care for everybody, and I try to be different, okay? And then the other thing is then it's a safe, they can talk to me, I hope. They realize it's open. And if they want to talk about faith and where they're stumbling, we have to start out somewhere. Okay, let's put aside the preconceptions. Okay, this is where I call it, if you want, I don't, in engineering, we don't talk about scientific method a lot, but it's like, okay, if we're going to do this, let's start out not deciding the answer before we are there. So let's put aside and let's look through it. And I think, well, I believe, and I can't prove this, but I believe that people that will honestly approach the problem of faith, or honestly approach really any problem probably, that they're going to then find out the answer, but you can't decide ahead of time. And so helping people, I think, come away and not say, okay, this makes sense. I say, well, let's look at it. Let's go through, and does it make sense or not? Let's not decide ahead of time. But if I don't care for them, if I don't have time for them, and that's tough for us, time. I mean, but I try to take time with students, and they're important, and that's a starting point, I think.
So you just convicted me there, because you see, I basically was thinking along the lines of science is going to bring people to Christ, and you just cut me right down. Love is going to bring people to Christ. I'm obviously all screwed up, but you're helping me.
We're all screwed.
You're helping me. So, Chad, what are your thoughts on the question that I now think I may have misrepresented?
So I guess for me, one of the first things that I ask myself, and it's a very fine line, and we have to be careful, but in a lot of cases, I don't think, some people will say I'm not a Christian because of science. That's actually, in a lot of cases, not true. They're just not a Christian. They're not interested in it. They were like I was when I was in my 20s, just don't really care. Somebody asks you why, you got to come up with an excuse. This is a culturally acceptable and easy excuse to make. And so you have to start by first finding out, do they really have scientific objections? And if they do, then you have to find out what those are. You have to explain to them, there's a lot of things I can't answer. I made it sound like, yeah, I got the genome figured out. No, I don't. There's still a lot of mysteries there. There's still things that they could point to. I say, I don't know why it's that way. And yeah. And there's a lot of things I take on faith, right? But you can point them to the fact that they're taking a lot of things on faith too. Just look around you. This exploded out of nothingness? Okay. Explain that natural law to me. All right? So for me, if somebody really is, if it's really a scientific issue, I want to know what that is, and then talk to them about it, and be humble and admit that I don't necessarily know the answers either. And just trust that God will continue to lead them into asking the right questions.
So you've given me an opportunity to give a plug for the Science in the Bible Club, because this club is 16 years old, and I was a very serious Christian when this club started 16 years ago, but I had questions, and there was no place where I could have an open, honest discussion of all the questions I had in science and the Bible and how these things fit, okay? And so your comment is a great one. Like, if somebody says science is holding back, say what specifically, okay? Right. But the problem that I ran into is that my church friends would want to talk about church stuff, and my chemistry friends wanted to talk about chemistry stuff, and there was nobody basically who had enough interest and knowledge to be able to talk about both. Right. And so it really wasn't until when I got involved in this club, and I know this sounds like a shameless plug, but it's really true, for the first time I could say to people like you, I don't understand this, are we really 75% the same as a banana? I say that's not a joke. One of my colleagues had a thing posted in the chemistry department saying we're 75% same genome as the banana. But I couldn't have an honest discussion with him because he was an unbeliever, okay? So, but I could have that discussion with you, okay? I mean, we need to be able to tease these things out and drill down. And I think when you start drilling down, you start to see that science is pointing to God. That's been my experience. The last 16 years, the more I learn about this field, the more convinced I have become that science points to God. And so, John, what's your take on people who say science is holding them back from faith?
Yeah, so if that was, I appreciate both of your responses of like, well, it would be useful to have a discussion about what is actually blocking you from faith.
Yeah.
But if it actually really was a science issue, someone was struggling with, can I really believe that God exists or not, or something like that. A thought that has been super helpful for me, and I hope it's been helpful for others, has been distinction between what I would call a mechanism versus an origin. And I'll explain that just real briefly. I'll use a chemistry example because chemist. So if you're studying a chemical reaction, you take, two compounds, A and B, and you mix them together to a beaker, and you can talk about the mechanism by which a reactant A and B interact, and which bonds are broken and which ones are formed to make products C and D, right? So that's a mechanism, and science is all over that, right? In that analogy, what science really can't answer is how compounds A and B came to be in the beaker, right? That's an origin question. And you can know a whole lot about the mechanism that once A and B come together, what's going to happen. But you can't answer that question, okay? And that statement is there's some fundamental laws that back up what I just said. There's a law, it's called law of detailed balance. And in physics, it tells us that the sum of matter and energy are conserved. Okay. And so you can interchange them. Relativity tells us how to do that. We balance chemical equations. Stoichiometry is conservation of matter, things like that. What that means is that to start describing stuff, you have to assume that what exists currently exists, right? Because sum of matter and energy are conserved. So you can't get past the point where it didn't exist if your fundamental foundational concept is that it had to be there, so you can start to describe it. That's mechanism versus origin. Now, if you look at a Richard Dawkins or a Peter Atkins debate, these are well-known atheists. They will always conflate those two concepts. The position is if by science I could explain the mechanism by which something turned into something else, caused the other thing, whatever, then I don't need to consider God. That's the basic argument, okay? But what they don't realize is that they're always just redefining the question, okay? They're never really answering the question of origin. They're just saying that once I got the stuff, I can explain how the stuff can change. And so helping someone understand that even if you could explain all the things that need to be explained, or that you'd want to explain, it doesn't actually matter. It doesn't actually answer any of the questions that regard faith versus science or any conflict, because faith and God's work is principally about origin, where it came from. He's the origin of it, and then the Bible's not a very complete technical document, so it doesn't tell us a lot about the mechanism. So we have to use your brains and we can figure some of that stuff out, But once you realize that those are so very, very complementary, then it helps tremendously in that kind of discussion.
There's one more thing. And I really liked how you said helping someone figure it out or whatever, because one thing I found is proving your point isn't very effective about helping that person. There's often you can prove or you can win an argument, but unless they want to, they're really seeking the answer, and you help them find it. That works. If you prove what the answer is, that may not help at all.
So as a moderator, I'm at a challenging point here because I said I would keep this to 5 o'clock, and it's 5 o'clock.
That's good.
But I also know that some people may have questions, and you guys said it was okay to have questions. So I guess what I'll say is, if you need to leave and want to leave, please feel free to get up and go, no problem. But if you guys have a few minutes to take questions.
I'm checking if I have a few minutes right now to
yes.
see if
You may have a
my old
soccer
I'm
practice
embarrassed
or
to
something
show
pick
people
up.
my phone.
It was raining pretty hard a couple minutes ago, so they might have canceled you.
Practice is going to be canceled for tonight.
It was raining pretty hard.
Yeah, okay, I'm good.
It was good. So, well, thank you for listening and for their comments, for their willingness to share. And are there questions that people have for the panelists? Well, you've answered everything, huh? Trey.
Can you, Chad in the middle, can you explain again kind of like what you meant when you said that we see like a degrade or decline in the genome? And would that align kind of like with what we see in the Bible when they talk about how like in the book of Genesis, all these figures like Noah, Adam, and Eve, they all lived like long lives. Is that kind of the same, or would those numbers be more symbolic?
So I had a statistics class at the University of Tennessee. The only thing I remember from that class, well, it was a forecasting class. And what he was trying to do, he gave us this time series of 600, 900, 800, and we were supposed to project this time series out. We didn't know what it was. We all projected it out, and we're going out, and it's rising slightly. And then he says, okay, then Noah's flood happened, and then people's lifespan went down like this. So I've always found that a fascinating question. So he was interested in it from can we do economic forecasts and so forth when there's an interruption to the system and it goes down. So, but yes, in short, yes. So I think if you look at any sort of genetic diseases, so for example, one of my research projects, we found a mutation that calves that had this mutation can't stand up. And so that was a broken gene. Even a lot of things that we consider normal variation are broken genes. So for instance, there's one gene that I love talking about in class because if you break it in cattle, instead of a black and white Holstein, you get a red and white Holstein. If you break it in horses, you get a chestnut horse. If you break it in dogs, you get a yellow Labrador Retriever. It has the same effect regardless of species if you break this gene. If you break it in humans, you have reddish hair and fairer skin. So a lot of the variation that we see is due to broken genes. And some of those broken genes are not all that important. You know, if we're not able to fully express this type of melanin, we have reddish hair, okay. Other genes, you break them, the organism can't survive. And so when I look at the genome, what I see is a slow degrading of genes over time. Some degrade more quickly because they're not essential for life. Which means, well, why would they be there in the first place if they're not essential for life from an evolutionary perspective? That's another way to think about that. But other ones, you know, and I think we can predict from that, you know, we'll see increases in genetic diseases over time and some of those types of things. And we see some of these and we tend to blame the environment, and I actually think it's our genomes degrading. But the answer to your question is yes, I think that at least part of the reason that we saw those lifespans drop probably is due to our genomes degrading compared to where they were at that point. Interestingly enough, a Russian scientist just got fired from his job for saying that, so I don't know. But yeah, but I think he's right. I agree with him on that point. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
And I don't know if I want to use the word colleagues because I don't want it to be like your friends, but in the fields where you work, when we might think sometimes people fudge the numbers to try to make evolution work, do you ever get accused that you're trying to fudge the numbers to make design work, creation work? Or do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, so in a professional setting, there is no discourse about design.
Okay.
It's just not allowed.
Okay.
Yeah. So the only allowed discourse in a professional setting is an evolutionary or a materialistic one. Yeah. Which is very telling, right? There is in any other context you would call it a crippling fear of a discourse. You just can't even allow it, right? In this context, I don't know if you would. I don't think anyone would call it a crippling fear, but functionally it is a crippling fear of any kind of discourse about design or origins.
Yeah, it's somewhat similar from my perspective, except that I'm not an evolutionary biologist, so it doesn't come up. Right? I'm studying genetic changes in cows over time. That is in a way, it's evolution of what you might call it microevolution or so on and so forth. But we're not projecting, well, a million years from now, cows are going to be, maybe they can use their methane to propel themselves or something. I don't know. But so.
You gave me a crazy mind picture.
But you're right. So, but it just doesn't. Now it does come up. So, for example, in that study, when we're talking about that broken calf gene, we talk about genes being conserved across species, and this gene is conserved, and this particular amino acid is conserved, and it's not conserved in my defective calves. That's probably a good indication that was what caused this genetic defect. And so then that language of conserved, when everybody hears that, they're thinking evolutionarily conserved. And I'm thinking God created it that way, and it's been conserved through natural selection, because if you break it, you have calves that don't stand up, right? Or people, and the same effect in humans and so forth. So, but the short answer is that I'm not an evolutionary biologist, so it doesn't necessarily come up where I would have those conflicts. So conversations with my colleagues, certainly it does come up.
I would say in engineering, these conversations don't come up very much. I mean, we're far enough away from that. And what I find is people don't want to talk about some of this. We can have difference of opinion, and people know that, but you don't talk about it that much. I mean, you do among like-minded people, but in the hallway conversations, I find that people already judge what you are. They know what you think, whether you do or not, and they avoid that conversation, or if they do, it's a negative conversation, and that happens. And I live with that. In fact, it used to upset me sometimes when people would assume they knew what I was thinking because I was a Christian, and then I realized that maybe God helped me think this is they realize I'm a Christian. I mean, that's what they think of me, and that's not a bad thing. I don't mind being different. But it also means I know the students, I know the people are always paying attention to me. Every class I teach, the first lecture when I'm introducing myself, I tell people that the most important thing in my life is my relationship to Jesus Christ. And so they all know. Well, the faculty and the staff all know. And when I screw up and I get angry or something else, well, I have to apologize for that. I have to act like a Christian. It doesn't mean I have to be perfect. It means I know they're watching, and some of them are waiting for me to stumble. But
Well, I mean, I think in a way this comes back to your comment about love, right? I mean, it's not like you're trying to use quantum mechanics to convince people to believe in God, right? I mean, I think the love is, we need to lead with love. And yeah, I think there are situations where if the science is a stumbling block, then like Chad says, what exactly, what
Yes.
specifically is it? Let's dig into it. But I do think at the root, people want love, joy, peace, forgiveness. These are not scientific things, right? These are the things people really need and want.
Yeah.
Well, that seems like a good stopping point to me. And of course, if you guys are able to stay around, then obviously any of you that want to talk to them individually, ask questions, whatever, get their emails, give them more email. I know they need more email. But thank you so much. I mean, I know not all the students appreciate this, but you get a hint of it from what Ken has said, and that is for them to publicly proclaim their faith is an act of faith, okay? There are people on this campus who hate that, okay? There are people on this campus that would like to have them never stand up as scientists and engineers and talk about Christ and spiritual matters, and we're doing what they can to make sure it doesn't happen. Like John said at professional meeting, it's verboten. You're not allowed to talk about these things, okay? So thank you guys for your Christian witness. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your willingness to be public about your faith. It's really wonderful. The students need it, the campus need it, and you're courageous Christians, and I'm so grateful for your lives. So let's thank you one more time, and we're grateful.
Really enjoyed meeting you guys and hearing.
I really enjoyed hearing you guys' stories and your perspectives.
Yeah, there's a lot of similarity in some sense.